When you talk about bumping a player, it's pretty much
great courage. One that says the bump is dead, that's how you deliver it.
What is going on, YouTube universe? My name is Trent. Some of you guys at home might know me as Zirra from other content I throw out here on YouTube, and welcome to the Hip and Shoulder, where we discuss everything AFL related. And today, we're back with another AFL video podcast known as the Round Recap, where we take time to reflect on the round that has just gone down for that AFL season, I suppose. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? I do apologize for this dropping, the day of round 9 kicking off. I did anticipate for this video to drop days ago, but at the point of this recording, I have had some things happen externally away from YouTube that have severely impacted myself, and it's kind of put me on the back foot a little bit. So I do appreciate you guys sticking with it, and we're just going to dive straight on in because I think I've delayed this video enough. Round 8 teased some classic rivalries that we have come to bear witness to, especially in recent years. Carlton versus Collingwood, absolutely sensational. Melbourne versus Geelong. Richmond Fremantle, even to a certain degree, has become a modern day rivalry given the scope of Fremantle beating Richmond after the siren numerous times. But then we also saw the classic rivalries. We saw Adelaide take on Port Adelaide. We saw the Q clash with Brisbane taking on the Gold Coast. We saw the Battle of the Bridge with Sydney taking on GWS. Many games did not fail to disappoint, but there were some games that I felt short of the mark, and some quite severely. The round opened up with Adelaide hosting Port Adelaide in the showdown, which we always know is going to be a great game to watch. And on different sides of the pendulum, you've got Adelaide, who have been thereabouts in the middle of the pack this year, touted as a top 4 team, but has been failing to deliver. And then you've got Port Adelaide on the other side, which is a team that should be within top 4 contention, has shown in recent years that they are a premiership contender, but always seem to fail to take that next step, always falling short of the mark. And coming into this game, given the scope of where both teams are at this year, I was soundly convinced Port Adelaide were going to win this game. And unfortunately, Port Adelaide were never in this contest. I think it speaks volumes at the end of the day when Jason Horne-Francis, who is playing predominantly midfield this year for Port Adelaide, kicks more goals off of his own boot than key forwards in Todd Marshall and Charlie Dixon kick combined. It's very harrowing for Port Adelaide, and while they've hit the recruitment drive really hard in the off-season, they brought in, a couple of years ago they got in Alira. This off-season they got in Zirk Thatcher from Essendon. They're filling some holes defensively, and they've created such a strong defensive core, especially with Asava Radicalea coming in as well. I think they've focused their attention too much on their defensive structure, and they have completely forgotten about the fact that even though they have young kids in Todd Marshall and Mitch Georgiades running around in that forward line, when they don't have Jeremy Finlayson or Charlie Dixon in that forward line, or even if they do but they're failing to fire, that forward line crumbles to shit incredibly fast. And then on the flip side of things, Taylor Walker is now starting to insert himself into Adelaide games after a quiet start. Isaac Rankin has found himself more midfield time with Adelaide and still manages to kick 3 goals off of his own boot in this game. Other players like Jake Saligo, a player coming into this year that not many people would have known his name, not especially outside of South Australia, really having a breakout season. Defensively, they don't boast these big names, but they have role players that are getting the job done. And they had reason to rise to the occasion for this showdown, because obviously during the week, Rory Sloane had come out, announced his retirement from the game effective immediately, and Sloane has been such an amazing servant, not just to the Adelaide Football Club, but to the AFL in general. He's such a likable person. He's a lovable character. He always wore his heart on his sleeve. He was always hard at the contest. He played every role that he needed to play. He'll go down in history, in my opinion, as one of the better Adelaide Crow players to pull on that jersey. And they lived up to the name of Rory Sloane by coming back and, you know, taking a rather big scalp in the end. I think it was 30-odd points the way of Adelaide, and as I said, it was a cohesive kind of performance that never allowed Port Adelaide to put one foot through that front door. They teased them a little bit, they gave them opportunity, but Port Adelaide never took that opportunity at all, and it's just compacted more so by the amount of injuries that have come out of this game for Port Adelaide, with question marks now surrounding how they're going to function moving forward, because some of these players that have gone down are rather critical when you look at the roles they play. Obviously, they didn't have Aliir available this week, at least I don't think they did, because of the concussion protocol that he suffered from St Kilda the week prior. Connor Rozee, the week prior, suffered a hamstring strain. He should have never been named, in my opinion. There's no way off of a 5-day turnaround you're going to have a fully healed hamstring. Comes out in that game, tweaks the exact same hamstring. He's already missing this week. I don't know whether he'll miss multiple. I have a feeling he probably will. And Ken Hinkley's tune changed pretty severely. Like, heading into the game, he was like, yep, he'll be playing. Medical team's giving him the clear. And then post-game, it was a complete opposite. Nah, we shouldn't have picked him. His body was not right. And I posed the question as to whether or not Ken Hinkley should be held accountable for this medical mix-up, because it's not the first time Port Adelaide have landed themselves in hot water because of, you know, medical disconcern. We've seen historically Port Adelaide have found themselves in situations where players have been concussed and they've been allowed to play on. You know, I think it was Hamish Hartlett in the past when he was playing has fallen under that. We've seen Lockie Jones and Aliir recently go through that same process. Connor Rozee obviously does a hamstring. Showdown, big game. He just manages to get named when he probably shouldn't have, and he's gone and tweaked it even more. You know, some people are saying it's the medical team's fault. Some people are saying it's Connor Rozee's fault. But at the end of the day, Ken Hinkley, not Hinkley. I said Hinkley, but I meant Ken Hinkley. He's the one at the head of the table. He's the one that is, you know, pushing for these calls to be made. When it comes to selection, the head coach has more bearing than anybody. And the medical team, I honestly don't think would have given Connor Rozee that 100% all clear, especially off a 5-day turnaround. I don't think that's the case. I definitely feel, and we're pulling our tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, you know, dues going on here. I definitely feel this was the case of feeling they had to play Connor Rozee because of the scope of the game, and now he's potentially going to miss weeks, which is unfortunate. And I was just touching on Port Adelaide's forward line. Todd Marshall and Mitch Georgiades are the future of that forward line, being as young as they are, and both of which ended the game on the bench with respective injuries. We had Georgiades come off with a ankle, I believe it was, and Todd Marshall was with a knee. It could be the reverse now that I'm thinking of it. It could be Georgiades that came... It was. Georgiades came off with the knee, Todd Marshall came off with the ankle. Regardless of that fact, if you're now missing those two players, you're solely dependent on Jeremy Finlayson and Charlie Dixon to get the job done. And Charlie Dixon has been so incredibly inconsistent. I feel since coming to Port Adelaide, he's threatened and loomed to be this big dominating presence that has never lived up to the moniker. Jeremy Finlayson, you could probably argue we've seen his best at Port Adelaide. He played well at GWS, don't get me wrong. But I think that transitional period to Port Adelaide has made him a better player. But you can't be too reliant on a player like that being your only source of, you know, scoring avenue. Willie Rioli was incredibly quiet as well. They brought him in as a player that was supposed to be this live wire forward. There's just so many questions that loom and go begging, and it's going to be even more so coming into this round because Jordan Sweet, who they've targeted as a ruck from the Bulldogs, potentially is going to miss this weekend due to illness, and they've already got Ivan Soldo sitting out on the bench for the next 4 to 6 weeks after having a clean out of his knee. So who are they going to play in that ruck? Does Finlayson come back in and potentially have to play that ruck role, or does Charlie Dixon now have to play that ruck role, or they're now playing a young kid like an Ollie Lord, who probably should be getting game time, but I don't know whether he's good enough to be thrown into that ruck role solely. I don't know. Port Adelaide need to do something to move forward, and I think they run into Geelong this week in Geelong, and if that's the case, oh fuck, Geelong are going to have a good little play time with them. And then we've got Adelaide, who have probably fallen short in some games that they should have won. I still argue they should have had a free kick against Sam Draper in that game to potentially win the game. But they've been building, and they're incredibly ominous as a team, because when you see them effectively and cohesively put these games together, it convinces you enough that they're good enough to play finals, that this is a team that is capable of reaching top 4 caliber, but it is their inconsistency that continues to let them down. At any rate, Port Adelaide falls short. Adelaide pick up a big win. Is this the beginning of Adelaide, using this as a catalyst to get their season officially back on track? Is Port Adelaide's season and top 4 hopes kind of now against the ropes? Who knows? Carlton, Collingwood, Friday night. I said this was going to be match of the round, and holy fuck was this a game. Now, this is barring the abysmal umpiring for both sides. I'm not at all suggesting Carlton had the better rub, but there were some instances for both teams that I find incredibly questionable, and it just goes to further push the point that I've been talking about in every single installment of this podcast series this year. This year has had to have been the most inconsistent umpiring we have seen ever. This has been a deplorable season by the umpiring fraternity, and while the AFL are now talking about bringing in things like premiership rings for every single player that participates in a premiership winning year, they're talking about getting all this technology set for this, the football that they're eventually going to integrate into the game, that is going to be able to tell us whether a goal kicked is a goal or a behind is a behind just based off the technology within the ball and what they're integrating. How about we try to focus our attention on making sure the level of umpiring is at a standard that is not going to drive the supporter base away from the game? How's that for a fucking idea? The AFL at the moment, of course, for those of you that follow the AFL, you would know, but some might not be so familiar, so we'll touch on it. And that is the fact of this lawsuit that is going on currently against the AFL from past players that have suffered concussion during their years of playing AFL, but are now experiencing symptoms that are hampering their everyday life. Brad Shepherd, who used to play for West Coast, can't sit in front of a computer screen or do any work from home or be in rooms with, lighting, because all that light fucks with his head. We've seen Paddy McCartan. We have seen Angus Brayshaw. We have seen, his name will come to me. It's kind of gone out of my head. The Collingwood defender, Nathan Murphy, all of which have had to, off of medical diagnosis and medical, assistance and kind of discussion, forced into retirement because of these concussion protocols. And it's the second time Paddy McCartan has been forced into retirement. And yet, with this crackdown on sling tackling and head-high hits to protect the player, we still find ourselves now in a position where players are now attempting to deliberately play for free kicks based off of head-high contact, none of which could have been more apparent than a tackle that was laid by Braden Maynard, I believe it was, against Owies from Carlton, in which Owies, during the tackle, dove off the ground, drove his head forward, and ensured his head made contact with the ground in order to draw a free kick. Incredibly fucking dangerous and incredibly stupid to be trying to attempt that, and I'm glad that the MRO and the tribunal system weren't sucked into having Maynard suspended for that act. They determined, obviously, there was no act within that tackle process that was deemed out of the ordinary or, harmful in any way, because Owies initiated that harm himself. Does the AFL now need to start looking at penalties for players that are deliberately trying to draw those frees by putting themselves in harmful position on purpose? Especially those players that get caught in tackles that could be deemed dangerous or a sling, where their head doesn't hit the ground during that tackle process, but they happily lay their head down on the ground or hold their head after a hit And even in some instances we've seen this year, a prime example would be when Richmond played Port Adelaide and Tom Lynch came through for a spoil on Zach Butters, made no head-high contact, did come over the top. Zach Butters throws the head back and grabs his head, gets a 50-metre penalty, they score a goal, but the replay shows there was no contact made at all. Players are making a farce of a situation that has caused some players to now not play the game anymore because of the injuries they have sustained. Players are now unable to live normal lives away from the game because of the symptoms that they're still suffering from these hits. I just think this needs to be looked at closer. It's a fucking joke. Outside of those calls, on the flip side, we had Collingwood, and we had some polarizing calls that probably should have gone against them, but didn't as well, especially late in the game. And I think the biggest one is Scott Pendlebury wins a clearance with, enough time on the clock, at least in my eyes, for Carlton to win a clearance, get the ball forward, and potentially have a shot on goal. This clearance is done in the middle of the ground from a centre ball up. Scott Pendlebury wins it, bangs it straight towards the boundary line, and the ball went for a mile. Because there was a player within the vicinity, they did not call it deliberate. But when you've got Scott Pendlebury who can potentially bang it straight forward down the line that way and hit it to their forward line, but instead decides to skew it off deliberately off to that side, it bounces out and they call it a throw-in, it just shows the discrepancies and the inconsistencies. Because if that was done, I can guarantee it, if that was done in the second quarter and the game wasn't only, within less than a minute to play, 100% the umpire calls that. Similarly to a couple of weeks ago when we saw Sam Draper lying on top of that ball. If he had done that in the second quarter, third quarter even, the umpire is going to call that holding the ball. The umpires don't have the balls to make the fucking close decisions when it comes to the crunch. It's almost as if they're told when it comes to a certain point in the game, put the whistles away because we don't want to be held accountable for decisions that could swing a game. Which is ironic, considering the umpiring this year, I feel, has swung some decisions, especially favourably to some teams. But this, regardless of that fact, and umpiring aside and my rambling aside, this was one hell of a contest, and it came down to the man himself, Nick DAICOS. Cometh the moment, cometh the man. Sam Walsh gives him too much space in a contest. Nick DAICOS gets the ball, nice little snag around the corner, if you don't mind, puts it through, and lives up to the Peter DAICOS name and legacy that has been left for his children. It's amazing to watch. This kid's only in his third year. He should have already had a Brownlow wrapped up in his second, and he just continues to be a big game player. And while I still have reservations about him and his inability to win contested ball and him rather being a outside player, which is, don't get me wrong, there are different types of players in the game. He's an outside player. He's not going to be an in and under contested ball type like a Harley Reid is going to develop into. That is okay. It is moments like this, though, that test your mettle. And Nick DAICOS stood up tall. And I honestly try to wrap my head around how good this kid is. And he could have a couple of weeks where he goes quiet, but then he comes out in games like this, and he has a tendency as well, I've noticed over the last 3 years of his career, well, the first 3 years of his career, that is, he loves to live within these big game moments, these big rivalries, these big clashes. He just goes to another level. It's so fucking great to watch. The question remains for Carlton coming out of this game is a question that I was posed at the start of all of these podcasts, at the start of the season, and that was a question posed to me by a good friend of mine who said, are Carlton's premiership chances hung on both Curnow and Mackay staying fit and both being out on the park? We're now looking at a situation where it still kind of involves that discussion point, but we're now looking at whether or not Carlton are too invested in Curnow and Mackay having to have big games in order for them to win. Because it seems to me that when Curnow is having a down game and he can't get his hands on the ball, or if Mackay isn't getting his hands on it, which this year isn't happening as often as it used to. I think Mackay is having an infinitely better year than Curnow is. I just feel when they're both not playing on a consistent level, Carlton as a structural, from a structural perspective, aren't delivering, and they're too kind of dependent outside of that on their midfielders having to carry the brunt, and I feel there's not enough of a forward spread when it comes to Carlton. Whereas you look at other teams that are within that window, you look at a GWS, you look at a Sydney, you look at a Geelong. Geelong have been winning games off the back of Tom Hawkins over the last 4 weeks, not even scoring a goal. Jeremy Cameron this past week didn't score a goal, but they're still finding avenues to score. And while Geelong didn't win this week, which we'll touch on later on in this video, they're still finding avenue. Whereas I feel Carlton, if you take Mackay and Curnow off the table, that avenue's taken away. I don't know. Feel free to argue that with me in the comments down below, but this game, in my opinion, is going to be, at least in my eyes, probably game of the year so far. There's going to be very few games that come close to what this game delivered for us on the weekend. The Battle of the Bridge, Sydney GWS. It was a game that I was most looking forward to because all year I have said that GWS and Sydney, in my eyes, have been systematically the best systems that we've seen in place. And that talks about personnel available, the game styles, game plans that we've seen executed. And this game, I think it failed to disappoint from a perspective of GWS. I thought they would have been up to the challenge a little bit more. However, Tom Green going down in the opening moments when he's had such an incredible year for GWS in the midfield, I think kind of put a stopper into how GWS could operate moving forward for the rest of that game. Because I'm not saying they're dependent on his ball use, but his in and under work and being able to feed the ball out to his teammates, I feel is very underrated from many. And you could tell GWS were missing that kind of feed in and around the contest. Sydney just continue to keep finding avenues and ways to just go about it. And I feel this is probably the best iteration of Sydney we have seen since their last premiership year. This is a Sydney that, had they have been the Sydney to play Geelong a couple of years ago in that grand final, I think that grand final could have very well been a completely different outcome, because the Sydney we saw play in that grand final is a shadow of what Sydney is now. Again, I think Lance Franklin's departure from Sydney has only helped them, and it's just so incredible to see the turnaround and the spread and these young kids living up to, you know, the expectation of the game. And it's kids like Errol Goulden and James Rowbottom and all these kids that were getting exposure over recent years into a Sydney lineup that might not have been delivering to expectation. It was all that early kind of exposure to the game and pressures and rigors of playing football that now holds Sydney in such great stead. And I think it's going to be the same for GWS with all these young kids they've got coming through their rotations now. When it comes to, you know, 2, 3, 4 years down the track, GWS are going to be primed to be one of the best teams in the comp. They are this year, but I think we're going to see a more consistently, you know, strong and dominating GWS because of the exposure that these kids are getting. And they're not shy to rotate these kids around and give these kids game time. Sydney's the same. It was a great game to watch, even though the margin might have been blown out a little bit more than what I expected it to be. But Sydney, just to me, have been the benchmark this year. Even though Geelong have only just dropped their first game for the season, you could argue Geelong, based upon stats, would have to be the best team of the year because they went undefeated for so long. I still feel Sydney have been delivering the best football, and it's hard to argue that when you see them get to work. They are incredibly great to watch as a neutral supporter. Similar with GWS, could we have potentially seen a teaser for the 2024 grand final out of this game? Because there are some out there that think we could see a Sydney versus GWS grand final. As a neutral supporter, I wouldn't be against it. St Kilda versus North Melbourne, I think, played out the way a lot of people expected it to play out. North Melbourne were in it up to their fucking elbows up until quarter time. And then it was just a downhill slide from there, and St Kilda just put the foot down and just sped off with the game, and North Melbourne were not able to catch up. And it seems to be the tale of the tape this year. North Melbourne come out, they look good in patches, but they just allow the team to get ahead, and then they're chasing. And they're chasing, and they're chasing, and they're chasing. Some people are questioning now whether if North Melbourne don't win a game for the year, should Alistair Clarkson's job be at risk? You know, how many more priority pick packages and everything else is this team going to get? And then on the flip side as well, coming out of this, Kane Cornes, which I don't read much into what Kane Cornes either writes or says, because let's face it, he's one of those journalists that is only ever looking to make a headline. And he definitely did out of this game, because he pulls Max King up and turns around and points out some of the goal hauls that some of the full forwards playing against North Melbourne have had this year, and has a crack at him because he doesn't kick 5 or 6. He still kicked a handful of goals on the day. I don't understand how you can take out of this win for St Kilda, oh yeah, it was good, but Max King should have kicked 6 or 7. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I just failed to see common sense ever coming out of that bloke's mouth. But it does, in certain retrospects, point question marks at this game from the angle of, what do we take away from this game? Because we knew St Kilda were going to win. Let's face it, we've seen North Melbourne play this year, we've seen St Kilda play this year. Quite obvious that one team is playing better football than the other, and one was going to get the win over the other. But does St Kilda take away enough from this game to be, spoken about on a winning platform? Or is it because they played North Melbourne, it's not going to be spoken about much? And then the same with North Melbourne. Another loss on the board against a team that they could have potentially beaten, because we've seen inconsistencies from St Kilda this year. So I don't know what kind of side of the spectrum we should be sitting on. I think the conversation about North Melbourne's only going to get worse as time goes on, especially if they continue to not win games. It's going to be interesting to see come the end of the year, if they do go winless, how this club is going to look heading into 2025. Because I feel, even though they have earmarked Alistair Clarkson as the coach that they want to take him to the next level, if you go a full season without a win, surely conversation needs to be had about some changes going on. And if they go without a win this year, there could be an exodus of players, because we already know Cam Zurhaar has already said at the start of the year he wants to play finals. He doesn't want to dwell on the bottom of the ladder for the rest of his career. So with the way North Melbourne's going, I feel he's already got his second foot almost out the door. You've got Luke Davies-Uniacke, who is a brilliant player. I don't know whether he's going to stay around in the same circumstances. It's just going to be very interesting to see what goes on moving forward. That's all I'm saying. Melbourne versus Geelong was a genuine arm wrestle. It was a game where Melbourne would hit the front, Geelong would hit the front, and it was a back and forth that I absolutely loved to watch. And coming into this game, Geelong was undefeated, 7-0, looking to continue that undefeated streak, but Melbourne had other plans, and it was on the back of Clayton Oliver getting back to his best. And I've been really bullish on Clayton Oliver this year. I've still got reserves and opinions about Oliver behind closed doors and how the AFL and Melbourne have kind of managed that. And I know that discussion, especially on social media, has brought some people, especially Melbourne fans, to anger points and tipping points. But regardless of that fact, he has had a very rough start to the year physically as well, but this game just saw him get back to his best. He was getting plenty of the ball. There were some instances where he still is using it very ineffectively when it comes to disposal, but he was lapping it up. He was feeding his teammates. It was the Clayton Oliver that we are used to seeing, and it's no coincidence that he rises to the occasion and Melbourne managed to get a win. And then, as I pointed out a little bit earlier, you look at Geelong and you've got players that just have been firing for weeks that just failed to live up to expectation. Jeremy Cameron has been, at least the last couple of weeks in my eyes, probably best on ground for Geelong, if not for that entire game that he has played over the last few weeks. Has a couple of opportunities this game to kick a goal to either get them closer to the lead or in front, and absolutely sprays the fuck out of them, goes goalless. Tom Hawkins, it's either 4 or 5 weeks in a row where he has not kicked a goal. And while Geelong were being applauded heading into this game for still being able to win and finding avenues to score without Tom Hawkins hitting the scoreboard, the narrative is now being driven a little bit differently because Geelong have lost. And they need to start getting more out of Tom Hawkins, because if they don't, question marks then start to get answered and asked in relation to whether or not he has stayed on a year too long. Because when you have a look at the way he's moving in games where he performs, some people would say, yeah, he's still got it. He's still moving around. He's still kicking goals. He's still looking good. But the last 4 to 5 weeks, you could argue that he's looked the exact opposite. He looks out of his depth, can't get his hands on the ball. There has been some instances, don't get me wrong, where he probably could have gone back and kicked some goals, but he's passed it off to his teammates to get his teammates involved. I feel with the caliber of Tom Hawkins, his ability to kick goals, his big frame, and the ability to rip a game open, he needs to start taking more opportunities, especially when, you know, Jeremy Cameron very uncharacteristically gets the yips and misses those shots. I was watching as a neutral, almost screaming at the TV every time Jeremy Cameron missed a shot, because we're used to seeing him being so cool and calm and composed. And it was almost like he was absolutely rattled in front of goal this game. I don't know whether it was the expectation of wanting to remain undefeated. It was the pressure of the kicks that he had having more weight to them because of the points of the game where he did have those shots. I don't know. But then you've got other players from Geelong that have just continued their form. You know, Max Holmes, great. You've got Zach Guthrie, managed to come from defence, go up and kick a goal. He's having a great season. Brian Myers, going about it and doing his thing. Ollie Henry, finding his feet at Geelong, which is great to see as well. Jai Clark, the rookie in his first year, had a great game, probably the best game I've seen him play for Geelong this year. It's coming to a point where we're having the same discussions about Geelong that we do Port Adelaide, and I know it's probably more of a knee-jerk reaction because Geelong have only lost the one game. But if you take Tom Hawkins and Jeremy Cameron's scoring output away from Geelong, do they have avenue to score? They've got Ollie Henry, but if Ollie Henry doesn't fire, then, you know what I mean? You can't hinge your whole forward line on a young kid like Ollie Henry kicking all your goals when you've got Tom Hawkins and Jeremy Cameron. I mean, eventually those two are going to move on and Ollie Henry's going to be your main man, but he at that point will have enough built around him to be able to, you know, be that effective forward on his own and win games off his own boot. Then you look at Melbourne and you do the flip side of things, and Melbourne have a makeshift forward line where they really haven't had anybody standing too tall. They don't have that tall key forward. You know, they've got Harrison Petty, but he'd rather be picking daisies out in the fucking off field because he has not been getting involved. He's not a forward to me. Petty should be getting played out of defence. He is not a key forward and shouldn't be playing as such. Bailey Fritsch is only a medium-sized forward, you know, being the leading goal kicker for Melbourne this year, as he has been for numerous years. You know, plays out of his skin sometimes, but he's still a little bit too inconsistent, and I feel personally a little bit too selfish when he gets around goal. But they found a way. They dug deep, and it was just a more complete, cohesive performance from Melbourne that saw them get over the line. It's going to be just an anomaly for Geelong, as I've said with GWS and Sydney when they have dropped a game. Geelong is still going to finish top 4. I don't think there's a realm of possibility where they have as hot as a start as they did and they not make the top 4. I still feel as far as the premiership goes, they're one of the biggest threats this year, but they got knocked off their perch a little bit, so they're going to come back down to earth crashing really hard. You would rather that happen early than happen late, so it'd be interesting to see how Geelong answer this loss, and it'll be interesting to see how Melbourne go moving forward, knowing that they've just taken this scalp. West Coast versus Essendon proved to be a much bigger contest than I think many would have anticipated. Optus Stadium is now becoming a fortress again for the West Coast Eagles, and they've found, I feel, a newfound belief and just a lot of exuberance and motivation and inspiration around that team. Coming into this game, you've got Essendon, who this year have been the best pressure team in the competition. Whether or not you buy into this Essendon edge or whatever the case may be, that's just straight facts. They've been the best pressure team, especially in my eyes. But the stats don't lie, and the stats back that up. And you've got West Coast, who have picked up a couple of wins. They've been really competitive in their recent losses. And when you look at the two, in retrospect, Essendon should have won this game quite convincingly. And in one point, it looked like the game was over at quarter time. You could have looked at the scoreline and thought, oh, here we go, Essendon are off to a 10-goal win. But Eagles dug deep in a very gutsy outing and performance. And as much as umpiring again comes back into the conversation with this game, especially not just with decisions that were paid, but non-decisions as well. And I think that's the biggest disparity when I do talk about the umpiring, especially from a Richmond point of view, which I know my mates still give me a lot of fucking shit about it when I talk about the umpiring. I'm not at all suggesting the umpiring itself is changing the discourse of the games that are being played. And they're not, you know, if West Coast lose by 10 goals or Richmond on the weekend like they did lose by 9 goals, I'm not at all suggesting that umpiring decisions are going to make up for that scoreline. But it is where they're paid, where they're not paid, and the week in, week out of having your back against the wall that is very not only demoralizing to players, but to supporters as well. And I feel we're going to come to a point, if there isn't an improvement with the umpiring, that fans aren't going to want to go to games because the games aren't being adjudicated to the level that they should be getting adjudicated. You know, this is a sport that is recognized worldwide. And we've got worldwide sports like soccer, the NFL and gridiron as an extension, rugby. You know, these sports have world-class umpiring and adjudication. And while some decisions might go awry every now and again, it's not as consistent or disparaging as the AFL is. And I think something needs to be done about it. But again, as I said, I feel it wasn't the umpiring that played hand in West Coast loss here, because there was one point in time, and I would love to know how West Coast supporters feel about this. I'm actually yet to turn to a friend of mine who is a big West Coast supporter to ask him this question, but there was an opportunity late in the game that I think it either would have won West Coast the game or it would have at least drawn the game at the time, where Waterman had taken a mark, and Waterman's been on fire the last few weeks, so you'd probably back him to go back and kick the goal. But Jamie Cripps thought he'd just start throwing some weight around and ended up reversing that mark and gave away a free kick, which took away a scoring avenue, which I think in turn would have driven a very heated conversation in the change rooms after the game. Those are coach killers, those moments. And when I saw that happen, I thought, oh fuck, he's just cost West Coast the win. And it's funny to think, coming into this year, West Coast would not only have the 2 wins already on the board, but they would be playing a consistent enough brand of football to finish a game within a kick of a team that has been regarded as the best pressure team in the competition. It's got to be credit to West Coast. And I know my mate especially was very triggered by adjudication in this game and lack of effort from some players, but I think you've got to take your hats off to West Coast in the situations they've been in over recent years, and then to come out this year and I think defy expectation has been rather huge for that club. I want to talk about one man though, and that is Zach Merritt. Conversation this week has been around who is the best captain in the competition for the 2024 season. And a lot of people are saying Darcy Moore. A lot of people are saying Max Gawn. I've said Zach Merritt. You look at this bloke and you look at the wins Essendon have had, it has been on the back of this guy carrying his team. He is incredibly underrated in the fact that he doesn't get near enough attention from the AFL's broader supporter base. Doesn't get enough recognition, doesn't get enough accolades in the way of being recognized for the talent that this kid has. He's still only in his mid-20s, so he's still hitting his peak. I think he's a Brownlow Smoky this year, especially if Essendon continue to win games. And I think he should very well be leading the chase for All-Australian captain this year as well. The year he is having is single-handedly one of the best years I've seen him play, and outside of Isaac Heaney, is one of the best performances I've seen by any player in the competition this year, which just continues to build upon the fact that there's no coincidence that Essendon has been playing as well as they have when Zach Merritt is firing. Richmond versus Fremantle, a game where I thought Richmond would get up and win. I knew the writing was on the wall, and I'm going to tell a bit of a story, and I think some of you are going to find this funny, because I didn't get to watch all of the Richmond-Fremantle game because I was in process of having to go through Melbourne to go pick up my kids. And on the way, I was on the train, driving through Richmond, and as I've pulled in, it would have been probably about pushing 3/4 time at that point. The platforms were full of Richmond supporters, and I thought to myself, oh fuck, this means we're getting absolutely towed, and all the Richmond supporters, especially families with younger kids, are trying to beat the rush, getting out of the MCG early to go home. Because I've been stuck in a crowd leaving the MCG after a game, despite a win or a loss, and fuck, it's hard to get through that crowd. So I can understand in some cases fans leaving, but we ended up losing by 9 goals in a game that I thought we should have been well and truly in. And there's 2 things to take away from this game. As much as I've spoken about the umpiring in a negative light, again, umpiring decisions here would not have made up for a 9-goal scoreline differential. But that being said, a couple of weeks ago, I heard, because I don't take note of free kick counts during games. I do after games and, have banter with my mates and whatnot. But there was a half of football where there was only 1 free kick paid to it was Melbourne, actually. It was Richmond-Melbourne. 1 free kick was paid to Richmond in the second half of that game. Similarly to this game here, Richmond had a half of football where only 5 free kicks were paid in a game where they lost the free kick count by half. Again, it's not about the calls that are made. It is about the non-decisions and the inconsistency of the non-decisions, as well as the location of those free kicks paid. There was an instance where Thompson Dow had the ball. There was a free kick paid. I think it was against Dustin Martin for holding, but it was paid to the ruckman, so it could have very well been against Toby Nankervis, which doesn't surprise me because Toby Nankervis is good for 2 to 3 free kicks against every game anyway. Free kick is paid. The siren goes seconds after the free kick. Now, given where the free kick was going to be taken from, Sean Darcy would have had to have kicked the ball from about 55, 60 metres out. Now, umpires in many situations pay a mark, pay a free kick, the siren goes, and depending on the location of the ball and the ability of the player holding it, we have seen the umpire call time off because there's no way that ball's going to make it through for a goal. They still have an opportunity for it to go over the top of the defence and everything else, but with where this ball was situated, there was no way Sean Darcy was going to get a hold of it, because I've never seen him roost a 55 to 60 metre kick and flush it through. The only ruckman I think in the competition that could hit it flush from that far out, and we've seen it happen, is Max Gawn, because he can do incredible things for a big man. But Thompson Dow, obviously ball in hand, free kicks paid, he hears the siren, he's heading towards the coach's box, kind of getting ready to head off the ground for the halftime break, drops the ball on the ground, umpire pays 50. Now, you call back to the time where Richmond played Sydney after the game, or at the end of the game, there was a free kick paid to Dion Prestia. Free kicks paid, siren goes, Chad Warner fucking torpedoes the ball out into the crowd, and they pay the free kick, but they don't pay the 50 because of common sense, because there was no way Chad Warner could have heard that whistle blown for the free kick when the siren went. You could probably argue with how marginable it was for the free kick and the siren going in this case, that Thompson Dow might not have known that this free kick was paid, in which case, again, common sense should prevail. But again, location of the free kick, Sean Darcy gets a 50, Fremantle score a goal. It was very similar against Melbourne, where all the free kicks that Melbourne seemed to be getting, especially late in the game, were in the defensive 50, where Richmond could have been potentially scoring, and it was players like Lever and May that were suckering those free kicks in. For Fremantle, it seemed to be all in their forward half, so every time they were trying to get the ball out, a free kick would be paid, and they were able to get the ball back in. They've shown free kick differentials and that Richmond are negative 330 over the last 5 years, and differentials talk about free kicks paid versus free kicks not paid. And I think questions are now going to be asked about heading into this game this week against the Bulldogs, whether or not the fact that mainstream media has spoken about the disparagement in umpiring decisions against Richmond, whether or not this round is going to see a turn of events, and whether all of this umpiring being highlighted is now going to cause them to come out and be a little bit more savvy to paying free kicks Richmond's way, which shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the case of mainstream media and, journalists and media experts on different shows, whether it be, AFL 360, whether it be on the couch, whether it's taken to news outlets, whether it be on the news, on television, or in written form. It shouldn't take this point in time for the AFL and umpires to wake up and realize, we need to start adjudicating this game more fairly and more consistently. And as I said, it's going to be a very interesting take to see how umpiring, especially towards Richmond, goes this weekend. But that being said, Fremantle played a very comprehensive game of football. You don't let a player like Luke Ryan, who effectively plays secondary fullback, have 40 possessions. Caleb Sarong gets off the chain as he has all year. Josh Tracy comes out, kicks 3 or 4. Amis kicks his couple that he's used to kicking. It's just a shame. I think the biggest thing for Richmond this year, and I've spoken about it to mates as well, again, to many a banter, injuries in certain locations have really hurt Richmond this year. And while I love the fact that Uze's been able to play young kids and expose them to the game, I think where Richmond have been hit the hardest is up forward. Take away Tom Lynch, take away Noah Bolter, we've had to rely on Maikelti Lafau, who is playing his first year. He was only drafted in as a supplementary draft pick, in the preseason draft, coming off of preseason training. He's had to be our number one avenue moving forward. We've had to play Shea Bolton out of our forward 50, not out of desire, but out of necessity. Dustin Martin has had to have been played out of that forward 50, not out of desire, out of necessity. And players like May and Lever from Melbourne, Luke Ryan from Fremantle, they're lapping up the ability to take uncontested marks because Richmond slot back into that process of we'll just bang the ball forward and hope for the best, but they don't have a Tom Lynch or a Noah Bolter there to pluck these big contested grabs that we are used to seeing both players take. We trade for Justin Kajiski. He can't break into the team because he's not, I feel, at AFL level. We've got Samson Ryan playing in the VFL. Can't get a game in the AFL. We've got Noah Cumberland, who can be a forward live wire. Can't get a game. I think I explained it perfectly to a friend of mine over the weekend. It's like Adam Uze is trying to build a puzzle at Richmond, but he's been given pieces that don't fit together because we've had to make a makeshift forward line on the fly. And while that has worked for some teams, it is failing miserably for Richmond. And coming out of that, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel because this week we have Dion Prestia, Jack Graham, and Noah Bolter all potentially available for selection. And just getting Noah Bolter back into that forward line, I think could really turn Richmond's favour around. And if Richmond can win against the Bulldogs because we start getting forward structure back, it'll kind of give a little bit of validation to the points I'm making right now. So I would love that to happen. But it's just I wouldn't say upset, probably a little bit more disappointed about the fact that at least when Richmond have lost in recent weeks, they've shown effort and they've shown some fight. But that fight disappeared in this game. And it was almost like the Richmond of old, the Tigers of old, where they would fall into losing a game and kind of just fade away and show no fight. And unfortunately, that's what they did against Fremantle. And it broke me a little bit. It really did. But we take each week as it comes and hopefully we can bounce back. Fremantle, on the other hand, continue a rather solid year and could potentially play finals. Who knows? Speaking of the Bulldogs, talk about fucking upset of the weekend. Bulldogs taking on Hawthorn, and I thought Bulldogs would have towered up Hawthorn convincingly, especially given it was at Marvel. And fuck if I didn't get home that night and find out Hawthorn beat them by a kick, no less. Hawthorn just have that ability to do that, and we've seen that over recent years. We've seen that they can be in a position where they're only going to win probably maybe 4 or 5 games for the year, but they always seem to rise against teams that people don't expect them to rise up against. We've seen them defeat Brisbane in the past. This year it's the Bulldogs, and it begs to question where that consistency fails to keep coming through, because they play as good as a game as they did here. They lost to Collingwood a few weeks ago, but they still played a very good game. But then the following week, they get absolutely hammered, and it could be the case this week. They get, they have a win against the Bulldogs, and then get belted the following week. I don't know whether it's a young list that allows for that inconsistency to happen, but I think Hawthorn fans will be happy to relish in moments like this, especially knocking off a team that should be thereabouts for premiership contention. And, well, I wouldn't say premiership contention, actually, because the Bulldogs have fallen off the mark a bit. At least finals contention. Realistically, I say premiership contention based off of the caliber of the talent that Bulldogs have and the list that they have. There shouldn't be a season that they go into with the list that they have available where their name shouldn't be discussed within premiership contention. I think that's where I'm coming from that point of view. But I think now the conversation now needs to be around what the fuck is going on at the Bulldogs. I still feel there is a lot happening behind closed doors that is not being discussed openly. There is definitely shit going on between Bevo and the coaching group. People have come out this week saying Bevo's been too harshly judged. Some Bulldogs fans are saying people need to lay off. But surprisingly, some Bulldogs fans that I've been interacting with this week, one of which is a good friend of mine as well, are starting to agree that maybe there is shit going on because of the way the morale seems to be going with some players, and some players being dropped out of the team that shouldn't be, and some players aren't getting games that they should be, and they're being relegated to the VFL. And Liberatore goes down. He's now concussed second time in 3 weeks, so he's going to be out indefinitely now. Poses questions as well, because only 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, they tried saying that he wasn't concussed. It was an ankle injury that he suffered. And then they ran all these tests and they said comprehensively, no, it wasn't concussion. It's something else. We've got to find out. But then this week they say, yeah, he suffered 2 concussions within 3 weeks. Do they think we're fucking stupid? Like, I don't understand where this thought process comes from. I don't know whether there now needs to be accountability towards Bevo and the Bulldogs, because they're clearly trying to go under the radar when it comes to medical diagnosis. Because obviously, if Liberatore he missed that game due to concussion awareness, but it shouldn't have been. It should have been logged as concussion. It should have been openly discussed as concussion. It shouldn't have been a thing where he should have been able to be left out on the field for that, few minutes where he should have been off getting assessed. It just impacts a year for the Bulldogs that has been so negatively spoken about, but with good reason. Ugle-Hagan comes out and signs a 2-year contract extension, which should be great for the Bulldogs fans to be talking about. But in the same retrospect, there were teams offering him, from rumours, up to 10 to 12-year deals. Like, that's fucking massive. Funnily enough, this 2-year extension takes him through to the draft year for the Tasmanian Devils. Is he playing it smart enough to potentially shift to a new club and be the beginning of something new? Who knows? But coming out of this game, you've got Hawthorn who dug in deep, to the point where Sicily pops out a shoulder, goes and gets a put back in, gets a jab, and he comes back out on the field to make sure his team gets over the line. And then you've got the Bulldogs, who I feel morale is so down internally, they're failing to live up to expectation of the standard that they should be playing at. It's going to be an interesting watch, because I feel, even though Clarkson should probably be the most under pressure coach this year, given the fact that North Melbourne haven't won a game yet, I think Bevo could be seeing a year where I think probably Bulldogs should be giving him the axe. And if they don't, I've said it for a few weeks now, I'll say it again, they don't axe Bevo, they're going to lose players. And the Q Clash rounded out round 8, Brisbane Gold Coast, in a game where it was game over at quarter time, quite compellingly. Brisbane had a stranglehold on this game from the beginning and absolutely demoralised Gold Coast in the end. And again, it starts to ask questions around whether or not Gold Coast are truly improving, which I think they are. I think we've seen that improvement. but they need to be beating teams, or at least being competitive against teams like Brisbane, especially given the year Brisbane has had, to be able to be considered and taken a little bit more seriously by neutral supporters. Big conversation point coming out this week, though, for the Gold Coast is they're looking at a rebrand heading into 2025. So they're still going to be known as the Gold Coast Suns. They want to keep the Suns moniker, but they're apparently going to go under a transition of a new logo and new jumpers, which are going to be more aligned with the yellow coloration, which is funny because it seems Damien Hardwick loves the color yellow. Because he's gone to the Gold Coast and now there's going to be a rebrand. But with that being said, I think Gold Coast find themselves in a precarious position where Hardwick's come out and said within the next 3 years we're going to win a premiership. And they find themselves in games against teams that have had struggling seasons. This is a game where Brisbane were hit hard with fucking injury. They had Starcevic taken out before the game due to an injury during the the pre-game warm-up rather. And Logan Morris, a young kid, debuts for the club. Luckily enough, had his parents in attendance to watch the debut, which was great. But this is a kid who played VFL earlier that day, ended up running a combined 22 kilometers over both games, had to borrow Will Ashcroft's boots to play this game, and the boots were way too small. This bloke was even sitting down, chowing down on McDonald's before his call-up. He wasn't expecting it. But they had to bring in a debutant to slot into that role. They already had another debutant coming in, playing a forward role. That you then had Lincoln McCarthy and Darcy Gardner both go down with ACL injuries, and I think they're going to be out for the year from talks. So there's Lincoln McCarthy is one of their most consistent forward players. Gardner comes in as a forward target. He's now down. They also had, I'm trying to think who it was that went down. Noah Answorth went down with a concussion, and we know he plays a defensive role there. So with all these injuries going down, they've got 3 players out. You've only got 4 players plus the sub on the bench, so they're down to 2 rotations, and Gold Coast couldn't capitalize on that. And I feel that's an opportunity where they should have capitalized on that. And there's now conversation about some players at Gold Coast going to undergo some role changes to better fit situations. But I feel the fact that Brisbane were able to rise to the occasion at the Gabba as well, mind you, where they haven't won a game this year up until this week. They've been losing games early. They've finally gotten back on their feet, but backs against the wall, losing these players to injury, but still managed to get a convincing win. You know, Lachie Neale playing in a game that was his best for the year. Josh Dunkley has been arguably Brisbane's best player all year. He still rises to the occasion. McCluggage, the midfielders just collectively were absolutely fucking sensational. Got to give credit to where it's due. The young kids for Gold Coast, even though they've been losing these games, have been good to watch. But Brisbane here, convincingly the better team. And as a neutral, just seeing them get back to their best in this game here, especially with those players out, you start asking questions again. How has this team not won a premiership? I don't understand. To bring the round recap to a close, it'd be ignorant of us to not turn attention to the ladder to know where our teams are all situated heading into round 9. Our top 4 take shape with Sydney sitting in first position, tied with Geelong, and GWS and Melbourne rounding out that top 4. Essendon sit in 5th place with Fremantle, Port Adelaide and Carlton rounding out 6th to 8th, all tied on the same amount of points but separated by percentage. Knocking on the door of the top 8 is Collingwood in 9th, with the draw putting them only 2 points behind. Gold Coast, Bulldogs, Adelaide, Brisbane and St Kilda round out 10th to 14th, with our bottom 4 being West Coast, Hawthorn, Richmond and North Melbourne. And with that all out of the way, with the round officially recapped, we can put it behind us and we can look at turning our attention to the Hip and Shoulder MVP award for the 2024 season. A lot of people do this, and I love the fact that they do this, and I love, collaborating with people online and discussing with people when it comes to, their decision making when it comes to giving votes out for their individual MVP awards that they do as well. But the hip and shoulder MVP works exactly like the Brownlow does. 3-2-1 vote system. I choose who I think was best on ground and give my 3 votes, my 2 votes, and my 1 vote out. And I always mention a couple of players that was probably in conversation for that 1 vote, but didn't do enough to warrant that 1 vote, if that makes sense. Again, the players are never going to get anything for this. It's a fake award. They're probably never going to give a fuck about it. They're probably never even going to see these videos, to be completely honest with you. But as I said, I just love, from my standpoint, being able to watch each game on the weekend, take note of how people are playing, and insert my own opinions on who I think was the better performers, because it opens up discussion points to have with people that watch this video and that I take to social media with. So, again, if there's anything you ever want to discuss with myself, AFL related, it doesn't even have to pertain to the round that's going on. It can just be AFL in general. Comments down below, or hit me up on my socials. They're linked down below as well. But we kick off our voting with the showdown, Adelaide versus Port Adelaide. Stiff to miss for the 1 vote this week. From Adelaide, I had Matt Crouch and Rory Laird. And from Port Adelaide, I had Ollie Wines and Dan Houston. The 1 vote for this game, I'm going to give to Isaac Rankin. He had a tremendous game. I wrestled with this decision with potentially giving him the 2 vote here. You know, he was very influential for Adelaide and played incredibly well. But I think it would be amiss of me to not give the 2 votes to Zach Butters, even though it was a losing performance from Port Adelaide. Zach Butters dug deep and from start to finish put everything out on the line. And that's all you can ask from a player when it comes to games like this, especially when Rosé goes down injured, and then it all hinges basically on the back of Horn Francis and Butters needing to elevate to the next level. I felt Butters was incredibly impressive. The 3 votes, though, goes to Jake Saligo, who I said earlier in the video has had a breakout year. A player where if you weren't from South Australia, if you weren't an Adelaide supporter, or you weren't a neutral supporter that actively aims to know players from every team, this is a player that you might not even know existed, but he's having a year that has been so stellar that he'd have to be in the conversation of being one of the most improved players in the comp. He's definitely the most improved player at Adelaide. Carlton Collingwood, stiff to miss. I've got Sam Walsh from Carlton and Jack Crisp from Collingwood. I'm giving the 1 vote, just ahead of Jack Crisp, to Scott Pendlebury. He might not have had as many clearances as Jack Crisp had, but his score involvements, his tackles, his ability to win his own ball, Pendlebury at his best, and I absolutely loved it. The 2 votes for me goes to Nick Newman. Defensively sound, kept Carlton in the game for as long as he did, almost by his own rebounding work, and his use with the ball, so great to watch. But best on ground, no questions asked, Nick DAICOS will even get the 3 Brownlow votes for this game. He didn't even rack up, not even rack up the most disposals on the field, I think, collectively on his own, but just his influence on the game was so incredibly huge, and to kick that winning goal late, you'd have to give him best on ground, kicking the winning goal off of your own boot when you had as much of the ball as he did. GWS Sydney, stiff to miss. For Sydney, I've got Dane Rampy and James Rowbottom, and for GWS, I have Finn Callahan, James Peatling, and Josh Kelly. I've given the 1 vote to Chad Warner, and this is going to be a trifecta of Sydney midfielders here. We've seen it in the past. But Chad Warner gets the 1 vote, Errol Goulden gets the 2, and Isaac Heaney gets the 3. When Sydney are at their best, it is these 3 players that are absolutely firing, and it's their ability not only to win ball around the ground, but to be viable forward threat options as well when moving forward half of the ground, is a string to Sydney's bow that not many teams can boast. Not many teams can say consistently they have a core midfield unit that can hit the scoreboard as well as Heaney, Goulden and Warner can collectively. St Kilda North Melbourne, stiff to miss for North Melbourne. Despite the loss, Colby McKercher played an absolutely brilliant game and has for the last couple of weeks. I don't understand how, even though he's in a losing effort, Colby McKercher can go back-to-back 30-plus disposal games and not get the NAB Rising Star nomination. That's just me. Stiff to miss for St Kilda, I've got Brad Hill and Marcus Winhager. The 1 vote, just ahead of Bradley Hill, I'm giving it to Tristan Cherry. I don't know how a player his size can be laying the monster amount of tackles he lays. I think it was, I can't remember the exact number, It was between 11 to 13 tackles this guy laid on the weekend. As a ruckman, his pressure work around the ground is absolutely sensational. And if Richmond was ever wanting to poach a fucking ruckman from anywhere, I would give Tristan Xerri the world. I would offer him absolutely everything he fucking wanted. I love him as a neutral supporter. My 2 votes this week goes to Darcy Wilson. First-year player for St Kilda. Played out of his skin in this game. He's been an outstanding performer for St Kilda this year, but this outing was arguably his best. Best on ground goes to Jack Sinclair. Obviously missed a couple of games at the start of the year, struggled to find his feet when he came back in, but now that he has, showing what he's fully capable of, and he takes the chocolates for me this week. Melbourne Geelong. Stiff to miss. Zach Guthrie and Brian Myers from Geelong with Jake Lever from Melbourne. I'm giving the 1 vote to Stephen May. Defensively, he was absolutely incredible. He was able not only to keep Tom Hawkins absolutely quiet, but just his ability to intercept mark and rebound out of that back half, especially in a game that ended up being so close, I feel played an integral role to Melbourne winning this game. The 2 votes to me goes to Max Holmes. He has played out of his skin this year. We saw the year they won the premiership, he missed out on that premiership run because of a hamstring, which was absolutely gutting because he had a great year that year. But his transition to halfback has been sensational to watch. And best on ground, I said it during the recap, it's Clayton Oliver. Back to his best. Huge amount of disposals. He was in and around everything, and it's hard to not give him the 3 this week. West Coast Essendon, stiff to miss. Sam Durham from Essendon, as well as Tim Kelly, Liam Duggan, and Jake Waterman from West Coast. The 1 vote for me this week goes to Nick Martin. I've been bullish on him on some weeks, but this week went about it as well as I've seen him go about it for a while. He's lifting his disposal efficiency, which is only making him a better player, and his rebound work off defensive half was great. The 2 votes this week goes to Zach Merritt, and while I wanted to give him 3, I think Darcy Parish was a better player on the day, which is why I've given Darcy Parish the 3 votes. But don't take lightly what I say about Zach Merritt. He is having a huge year, and I think him and Isaac Heaney right now are in a very tight arm wrestle for the Brownlow. Richmond Fremantle, stiff to miss. The only Richmond player to be named in this at all is Jaden Short. Andrew Brayshaw and Matt Johnson from Fremantle stiff to miss as well. I'm giving the 1 vote to Hayden Young, just ahead of Andrew Brayshaw, purely based off the 2 goals he was able to go forward and kick. Being able to obviously add that string to his bow and being able to score just puts him outside of grasp of the 1 vote for Andrew Brayshaw. My 2 votes goes to Caleb Sarong, absolutely dominated that midfield core. But Luke Ryan in the back line, having 40-odd disposals, had a monster amount of marks, huge amount of meters gained, comfortably best on ground. Bulldogs Hawthorn, stiff to miss for the Doggies. I've got Adam Treloar and Bailey Dale with Dylan Moore and Jai Newcomb, stiff to miss for Hawthorn. James Sicily I'm giving the 1 vote to. Defensively was incredibly great, but I think just the leadership in popping your shoulder out, getting it popped back in, coming back out to ensure your team gets over the line, just shows the type of player Sicily is. And while he does a lot of dirty, grubby shit, it's things like this that build a very incredible and inspirational leader. And he just had a great game. I loved how Sicily went about it. 2 vote goes to Marcus Bontempelli. Although playing in a losing team, he was best on ground for the Bulldogs by a mile, and he just did Bontempelli things. We've come to expect what to get out of him. Could have gotten the 3 votes, but I think who played a more influential part in their game for their respective team was Jarman Impey for Hawthorn. I thought the influence he had with the amount of disposals he had at his disposal put him best on ground on the day. Now, Marcus Bontempelli might very well get the 3 Brownlow votes here, but I think Jarman Impey was best on. Final game of the round, Brisbane Gold Coast. Stiff to miss for the Gold Coast, I've got Ben King and Sam Flanders. Stiff to miss for the Brisbane, I have Hugh McCluggage and Jared Berry. But we're going with I was going to say a midfield core, but we've got a defensive player coming in at the 3 here. Lachie Neale gets the 1 vote for me, only beaten out by Josh Dunkley because of the role Josh Dunkley played. Josh Dunkley had a huge amount of disposals, huge amount of tackles, but played a clamping, tagging role on Matt Rowell. And I think even though Lachie Neale might have had more numbers than Dunkley, The fact that Dunkley was able to tag Rowell, take Rowell effectively out of the game, but rack up the monster amount of disposals he had, it just shows the quality of player Josh Dunkley is. But best on ground, Dane Zorko had 40 disposals of his own, and it's performances like this that remind you that Dane Zorko still has great football left in him. The conversation this week was who was the better player out of the round, Dane Zorko, Luke Ryan. Let me know in the comment section what you think. But he gets the 3 votes for me compellingly. And with those votes now entered in, as you can see on screen, every single player that will now be named and displayed has gotten at least 1 vote since round 0 up until the end of round 8. And we have a few players now coming through as well. But we do comprehensively have a top 5, which I'm going to highlight right now. In 5th place, we have a 3-way tie on 9 votes between Marcus Bontempelli of the Bulldogs, Jeremy Cameron of Geelong, and Jack Steele of St Kilda. In 4th place, moving up on 10 votes, we have Nick DAICOS of Collingwood. In 3rd place, on 12 votes, we have Tom Green of GWS. In 2nd place, on 15 votes, we have Caleb Sarong of Fremantle. And back to a tie in 1st place on 19 votes, we have Zach Merritt of Essendon and Isaac Heaney of Sydney. And I'm telling you now, this is going to be an arm wrestle for the Brownlow between these two. I don't think outside of maybe Caleb Sarong, there would be many people challenging for the Brownlow at this point in time. That is it for today's podcast. Do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please do me a favor, hit that like button down below. Be sure to subscribe if you're new around here as well. Trying to build a community of AFL loving supporters, and I would appreciate it a lot if you took the time to get on board and help grow this community. Let's try to make this something where we can all collectively come together to share our love for the game. That's what it's all about. And I want to thank you guys as well for not only all the love you have been showing on the content I've been doing, but also sticking with me during me being sick and the shit that I've been dealing with. It means so much that you guys stick around and come out like you guys do to support what I do. But that's it from me, guys. I'm out of here, and as always, I will catch you guys next time.